All right. Well, hello, everybody. So my name's Ian. I'm with the Organization for Bat Conservation. And today I'm going to talk to you about and show you some bats. Now, before we get started, I want everybody to close your eyes. Everyone close your eyes for a moment and picture a bat. Just any bat. All right, now go ahead and open your eyes. So the bat that you, whoops, I have the picture upside down. The bat that you're thinking of might have looked like some of the bats on this picture here, but it probably didn't look like all of the bats that we've got here, because all of the bats in the world don't look like each other. There's a lot of variety in bats. There are over 1,300 different kinds of bats in the world. They come in all sorts of shapes, all sorts of colors. You can find them pretty much anywhere in the world. They will live anywhere except for places where there's always snow. You won't find any bats in Antarctica. You won't find any bats in the North Pole. But other than that, you'll find bats just about everywhere. They eat all sorts of different things. They live in different habitats. You can find bats in the forest, in the fields, in the streams, in the wetlands. You can find them living on the mountains. You can find them living in the rainforest and the deserts. They're very, very adaptable. And they're a very cool animal, but there's something that we tend to not know a lot about. Because when we see a bat outside in the wild, it's not likely to be in a way that we're going to be able to get a really good look at it. For hundreds and hundreds of years, the only way that people would normally see bats would be if they were flying overhead really fast in the middle of the night. And because of that, it's hard to know a lot about something that's just flying over your head in the middle of the night. So there have been stories about bats for hundreds and hundreds of years, but it's only recently that we're starting to really understand what bats are like and really understand the sorts of things they do for the environment and surprising ways that they're kind of good for us too. Now, even though there are so many different kinds of bats in the world, there is one thing that keeps them all in common. All bats can fly, and bats can fly pretty well. They are one of the only flying vertebrates, so animals with a backbone, to ever have existed on Earth. And they are the only flying mammal. Now, when I say flying vertebrate, I mean animals with a backbone. So the bats count and the birds count too. But birds and bats actually fly very, very differently. So first, I want you all to put out your arms. Put out both arms and squeeze 3 fingers together. So make an OK sign with your one hand and then take your other 3 fingers and squeeze them together. And then spread your arms out. And now, and this is important, and now, without hitting anybody who might be sitting around you, everybody flap your wings. So now you're flying how the birds fly, but the bats actually fly very, very differently. So for the bats to fly, it's more like if everyone puts out their arms again, and then bends their arms at the elbows, and spreads their fingers as far apart as they possibly can. And pretend that you have skin in between all of your fingers. And this time, everyone flap your hands. So now you're flying how the bats fly. So when the bats are flying, their entire wing is really just their hand. You can count the fingers in their hand. They've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fingers, just the same as we do. It's just for them, their fingers are all connected by this really thin skin. And that way, they have a very, very flexible wing, but they also have kind of a fragile wing too. Now, a lot of the times when people are looking up in the sky, it's hard for them to tell, hey, is that a bat? Hey, is that a bird? Well, because of the way their wings work, birds can do something that bats can't. Birds can glide. So if a bird's flying through the sky, a lot of the times it'll flap its wings for a bit and then glide for a bit. A lot of the bats, especially the bats we have around here in North America, can't glide at all. So they have to be flapping their wings constantly. So if you look up in the sky in the middle of the night and you see something flapping a little bit and then gliding a little bit, that's probably a bird. If it's flapping all the time, it might be a bat. Now, I was talking a little bit about the things that keep bats the same. So they can all fly, and they're all what we call nocturnal. So, nocturnal animals are animals that sleep during the day and wake up at night. So when they wake up at night, they do all the same sorts of things that we think of animals, most animals doing during the day. They'll find food, they might interact with each other. That's just their time to be awake and be active. But there are a lot of things that make the bats very, very different. So we divide the bats into two big groups, the microbats and the megabats. So first, I'm going to show you a picture of a microbat, and then we're going to look at some live microbats. So this is a microbat. Now there are a couple things I want you to notice. First of all, take a look at this bat's eyes. This bat has some teeny tiny little eyes. Now he does have eyes. All bats have eyes. All bats can see. It's just that some bats don't rely on their eyes too much. Instead, they rely a lot more on their ears. The microbats have tiny little eyes and really, really big ears because they don't focus on their eyes. They focus not only on their ears, but also on something called echolocation. So, echolocation is this little sound that these bats can make out of their mouths. And that sound will go out and bounce off everything around them and come back to their ears. And when that sound comes back, based on how that sound has changed, they can use it to make a little map in their head of what's going on around them. They can use that to see things like, hey, where are the bugs? Where are the birds? Where are the trees? All very important things for a bat to know. Now, a bat's echolocation is so sensitive that it can detect a single hair on a human head. So they can see really, really well with their echolocation. All right, I'm going to bring out the first bat for everyone to meet. So the first bat's name is Sousa, and Sousa is a big brown bat, which means that Sousa is a member of the second biggest kind of bat that lives where we are right here in Michigan. So everyone prepare yourselves to meet Sousa, our big brown bat. Ta-da! This is Sousa, the big brown bat. Now, you may have noticed, Sousa here is not very big. But you know what? For a bat that lives in a lot of the United States, this is pretty big. Our bats around here in Michigan are really, really small. Now, I'm going to go grab a light just for a moment so that you can all get a better look at Sousa. Give me just 1 second. All right, so there we go. Hopefully that gives you a bit of a better look at his face. So Sousa here, like I said, he's a big brown bat. Now there are a lot of bats that live in a lot of the United States, including Michigan, that are much, much smaller than Sousa is. And part of the reason for that is because all of our bats around here in the United States are insect eaters. They all eat insects. So if they were really, really big, they'd have to get even more insects just to keep themselves full. So a lot of them are pretty small. But even a little bat like Sousa here can eat tons and tons of insects. So I want you all for a moment, everybody turn to the person sitting next to you and tell them how many bats you think Sousa can eat in one night. I'll give you about 10 seconds. All right, so let me tell you, Sousa can eat 2,000 to 4,000, maybe up to 6,000 mosquito-sized bugs in one night, which is a lot. Now, he doesn't just eat mosquitoes. A bat like Sousa eats all sorts of insects, including a lot of beetles and moths, which is really, really important because a lot of those beetles and moths would otherwise be eating farmers' crops. They'd be eating all the food that the farmers grow for us. So, kids, I want you all to raise your hand if you like tomatoes. Now raise your, ketchup still counts. Raise your hand if you like ketchup too. All right, now raise your hand if you like apples. Now raise your hand if you like corn. All three of those, tomatoes and apples and corn, are all eaten by insects that the bats eat. So without the bats around, we would have a really difficult time growing any of those foods. In fact, we think if every single bat were to just vanish from this part of the world, it would probably cost our farmers in the United States right around $23 billion just in crop loss and extra pesticide. Now, as he's been waking up here a little bit, Sousa has been starting to echolocate. Now, echolocation is a sound that's so high that we can't hear it with human ears. Human ears can't pick it up at all. It's a very loud sound, but it's so high that we can't hear it. However, I have here a very fancy piece of electronic ears that will let us listen to it just fine. So this is an iPad, and attached to this iPad, this little black box is called an echometer. And that echometer will take Sousa's echolocation down to a frequency that we can hear. So everybody, listen up. Well, Sousa doesn't seem to want to echolocate anymore. Oh, no, it's a problem with the echometer. All right. Well, I seem to be having some trouble with the echometer at the moment. But for the most part, echometers, which you can, I'm sure, find videos of online, will take a bat's echolocation down to a frequency that humans can hear. And that way, we can know when there are bats around just by holding up an echometer and trying to listen to the sound that it's making. All right, I'm going to put Sousa back. Everybody go ahead and wave goodbye to Sousa. Now, all of the bats that we have around here in Michigan are microbats. They're all these bats with these tiny little eyes, these much, much bigger ears, who rely on that echolocation. So in other parts of the world, there are what we call megabats. Now, we're not going to get to a megabat quite yet. We're going to look at one more microbat, but it's a very, very different sort of microbat, mostly because of what it eats. So the microbat that I'm going to show you is called a Jamaican leaf-nosed bat. And it's a fruit bat that lives in South America. So give me just one moment to grab Tenny, our Jamaican leaf-nosed bat. right. So this is Tenny, our Jamaican leaf-nosed bat. Now, Tenny is a microbat, just like Sousa was. It's just that unlike a microbat, she is a fruit bat. So she has this big thing that looks like a horn on her nose there. Now, that is not a horn. That is an organ that these bats use for echolocation. So, Tenny is an echolocating bat, just like Sousa is. But unlike Sousa, Tenny spends all this time flying around with these giant chunks of fruit in her mouth. And if she were to echolocate out of her mouth, all of those sounds that she's making would just be blocked by the piece of fruit in her mouth, and it wouldn't do her any good. So instead, she echolocates out of her nose. And that way she can fly around with these big chunks of fruit in her mouth and still be able to echolocate. Now, the fact that she flies around so much with these giant chunks of fruit in her mouth is actually really important for the rainforest. Because a lot of the times, as these bats are flying around in the rainforest with these giant chunks of fruit in their mouth, they don't eat the entire piece of fruit. They juice the piece of fruit, they swallow all the juice, and they spit out the rest. And that includes all of the seeds. So these bats are flying through the rainforest, spitting seeds everywhere. And when those seeds land in the rainforest, they grow new fruit trees. And again, a lot of those fruits that they'll spread the seeds of, a lot of them are things that we as humans like to eat. And others of them are plants that are important to us for other reasons. They're very important, especially when parts of the rainforest get cut down. It's really important that animals like the bats spread seeds around to grow those parts of the rainforest back. All right, I'm going to put Tenny back. So, there is one other thing I want to talk about before we look at our megabats. So unfortunately, even though these bats are so great for us to have around, bats all over the world are kind of having some issues. And one of the biggest issues that the bats are having right now in the US is something called white nose syndrome. So white nose syndrome is a disease. It's a fungus that came over to the United States from another part of the world. It's what we call an invasive species. It was brought over here probably by humans, probably on accident. And when it infects our bats here in the United States, it makes this little white ring of fungus around their nose and mouth. And that ring of fungus will wake bats up from hibernation. Now, it's very important that our bats around here in the US hibernate because they're all insect eaters. And without the insects around in the middle of winter, they have no way to get energy. So when they get white nose syndrome, it wakes them up in the middle of winter. It costs them a ton of energy to wake up. And then again, without the bugs around, they don't have a way to get that energy back. So they end up starving to death. And it's a big problem. It's killed about 7 to 8 million bats in the United States so far. There are things that are being done about white nose syndrome. Universities and government agencies like the DNR, the Forest Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, they're all doing things to try and help with white nose syndrome. Now, unfortunately, white nose syndrome is also adding to the problems that the bats were already having. So things like losing habitat when trees are cut down, when wetlands are drained. Suddenly, a lot of these animals either don't have a place to live or they don't have a place they can go to find food. Or chemicals can be a big problem too. Things like pollution and pesticides, especially pesticides, because if those chemicals get on the insects and the bats eat the insects, those chemicals will get in the bats, and that can cause them a lot of trouble too. Now, there are things people have been doing to help the bats. I already mentioned that it'll help them, that people are doing some research on white nose syndrome to try and figure out ways to go about developing cures for that. Another thing people are doing is building bat houses. So this is a bat house. It's a lot like a birdhouse, except it's for bats. And when the bats are living in this bat house, they land on this piece of green mesh. That kind of gives something for their toes to cling to, and then they'll scurry up into this little slot. Now that slot there is really, really narrow, because that way the bats can get up there, but things like the owls and the hawks and the cats can't reach up there and grab them. So when the bats are living in this bat house, you could get just about 100 bats in a bat house this size. A lot of the times, the reason you can get so many bats is because you get mothers with their babies. And the mothers are looking for a really nice, safe place to raise their babies. And a bat house that's in the right spot absolutely fits the bill. So building bat houses is one thing people have been doing to help the bats. There's also been a big push for planting wildflowers, because wildflowers, so flowers that don't have to be planted by people, flowers that you could find growing out in the woods or in the stream, or the wetlands more so, I suppose, or in the fields in your area, all of those flowers will attract insects. And those will be insects that the bats, the birds, the amphibians, all these animals will be able to eat. So by planting more wildflowers, we kind of give a hunting ground for all of these animals. We provide somewhere that they can go to find food. Okay, is everyone ready to meet our first megabat? So before we do, I want to say, if you have ever read the book Stella Luna, this next bat is the same species of bat as Stella Luna. The bat I'm about to show you is named Zazie, and Zazie is an Egyptian fruit bat. So give me just one moment to grab Zazie. So this is Zazie, one of our Egyptian fruit bats. Now, couple of things to take a look at with Zazie. First of all, Zazie has a very different sort of face than the other bats we were looking at earlier. He has these really big eyes and this nice sensitive nose. And part of the reason for that, part of the reason the megabats have such big eyes and generally more sensitive noses is because they don't echolocate. Most megabats don't echolocate at all. Now Zazie, as an Egyptian fruit bat, actually can make something that's an echolocation. It's not quite the same. He can make a bunch of little clicks, but it serves a similar purpose. It kind of gives him an idea of where he is and where he's going. But almost all of the megabats are either fruit bats or nectar drinking bats. And fruit and flowers, they don't fly away very fast. So it can be a lot easier for them to rely on their eyes to look for the bright colors that fruit usually is, or to rely on their sensitive nose to try and sniff out that fruit as a way for them to find food. Now, you've also probably noticed that Zazie's ears are going all over the place. He is listening for sounds in all sorts of different directions. He has much better what we call directional hearing than we do as humans. So Zazie can tell more or less everything that's going on in this building just by moving his ears around like that. Now, the megabats can't be found anywhere on this side of the world. You can't find any megabats in North America or South America. They're all living in places like Asia, Australia, and Africa. He is pretty cute, too. Now, a lot of the times, you'll hear people call megabats flying foxes. So, they're not dogs, they're not foxes, and they're not really even closely related to dogs or foxes. The bats are kind of their own thing. They're not too closely related to anything else, but you can definitely see why people would call them flying foxes with those big dog-like faces like that. All right, I am going to put Zazie back. Now, a lot of the times, people will ask what the biggest bat in the world is. So the biggest bat in the world is called the Malayan flying fox. Now, the Malayan flying fox, if they were to spread their wings out all the way from the tip of one wing to the tip of the other wing, they have a wingspan of just about 5 to 6 feet, which is pretty big. If I were to stand up, I'm about 5 to 6 feet tall. So their wingspan is about as wide as I am tall. But I want you all one more time, turn to the person sitting next to you and tell them how much you think the biggest bat in the world weighs. How many pounds do you think they weigh? All right. Now everyone turn back to me. Even the Malayan flying foxes, the biggest species of bat in the world, only weigh about 3 pounds. Bats have to be really, really light to be able to fly. So even then, even the biggest bats in the world only eat fruit, only live in Asia, and they only weigh about 3 pounds. Now, I'm going to show you the biggest bat that I have to show you all today. His name is Boomerang, and Boomerang is a straw-colored fruit bat, which means that Boomerang is one of the biggest bats that lives in Africa. All right, this is Boomerang, our straw-colored fruit bat. So you can see that there are some things about Boomerang that are very, very similar to things about Zazzy. So if you look at his face, let me bring the light over so you can see his face a little better. If you look at his face, he's got those really big eyes again, and he's got that nice sensitive nose, because Boomerang actually doesn't echolocate at all. We were talking about how the Egyptian fruit bats can echolocate a bit, but Boomerang can't echolocate at all. And you can see him doing the same thing with his ears. He's also listening for sounds in all sorts of different directions. And I want you also to take a look at the color on Boomerang. Boomerang's got this pretty yellow color. He's especially got this nice yellow right underneath his chin. So that yellow is there for the same reason as things like a lot of the birds, the boys might be a really bright color, because that color is for attracting the ladies. The lady straw-colored fruit bats find that nice bright yellow color to be very attractive. So a lot of the boys will have a really bright color there. Also, take a look at his back. So he's got sort of that stripy pattern on his back there. Now that is there for about the same reason as things like zebras will have stripes. So it doesn't help them, it does to a degree help them blend in with their environment, but it also helps them blend in with each other. If Boomerang has all of those stripes on his back and all the bats that he's around have a pattern on his back too, then that pattern will help it make it very hard for a predator to be able to tell the bats apart and be able to single one out. Now I also want to take a moment to show you Boomerang's wings. So I'm going to spread one of his wings out here. So his wing, like we were talking about earlier, is, oh, now he's doing it himself. Thank you, Boomerang. His wing is this really stretchy, thin skin. If you want to know what a bat's wing feels like, you can close one eye, take one finger, and touch your eyelid. That's about what a bat's wing feels like. Now, you may have noticed, too, that he's got these hooks hanging off of his wings there. Those hooks are his thumbs. We were talking about how a bat's wing is really just their fingers spread out all the way, and then their thumbs are separate from the rest of their wing because they can use those thumbs as a way to be able to climb, as a way to be able to help them find food, all sorts of useful things. Now I'm going to start going over just some questions that people have a lot of the times about bats. But before I do, I'm going to put Boomerang back for a moment. And I want to mention one last thing that people have been doing a lot recently to help the bats out. One of the most important things to help the bats is just talking to people about bats and teaching people about bats. Because unfortunately, bats are something that we haven't known about for a very, very long span of human history. There are a lot of stories about them. There are a lot of old wives' tales. So just talking to people about bats and teaching people about bats really does a lot of good for the bats too. So I have something for all of you to do at the end of the day here. I want you all to tell one person one cool thing that you learned about bats today. And it has to be someone who's not in the room with you right now. All right, because that really does help a lot. So one of the questions that we get a lot about bats is how old they are. So bats can live to be pretty old ages, especially for mammals of their size. Boomerang there, the last bat that I showed you, is in his early 20s, which if you compare that to an animal like a rabbit, or a squirrel or another mammal of that size, that's pretty old. And it's something that we don't entirely understand yet. It's something that we're still trying to figure out how exactly the bats can live quite so long for a mammal of their size. Another question that I get a lot about the bats is why do they hang upside down? Because famously, bats absolutely do hang upside down. They'll spend almost their entire lives hanging upside down. And part of the reason for that is because of their hips. So I want everyone, just for a moment, take a hand and feel your hip. We as humans have these nice, thick, bony hips. And those hips help us stand up. But the bats have really, really thin hips. And a lot of the times they can't support themselves on those hips. They can't stand up the way we do. So they hang upside down instead. And it makes sense when you think about it, because those thin hips make it so the bats are lighter, so that then when they're flying, it doesn't cost them as much energy. Energy is really essential to flight. It costs bats tons and tons of energy to fly. That's part of why they eat so much. Now, another question that we get a lot is about babies. So, how many babies does a bat have? Well, a lot of the times, bats have very, very few babies. A lot of bats will only have one baby at a time. Some bats might have twins. Some bats occasionally will have maybe 4 or so, or maybe 3 babies, but for the most part, it tends to be 1 or 2. And part of the reason for that, again, for at least a little while, the mama bat is going to have to fly with the baby bat clinging to her belly. If she had a lot of babies clinging onto her, it would be really, really hard for her to fly. Now, none of the bats that I showed you today are babies, but for how big a baby bat is, they tend to be about 1/3 of the mother's size, which means there can be some pretty small baby bats. Now, lastly, one of the last questions that we get a lot is, will bats bite you? What about rabies? And what do you do if there's a bat on the ground or a bat in your house or something like that? So let's do the first one first. Will a bat bite you? So a bat is not going to fly around and look for a human to bite. They're not just going to swoop down and latch onto you or anything like that. But if you find a bat in the wild and you pick it up, it'll be scared. And then to defend itself, it absolutely might try and bite. So never pick up a bat that you find in the wild, especially not with your bare hands. And if you ever do get bitten by a bat for whatever reason, you should tell someone immediately. If you find a bat on the ground, just leave it alone if it's outside. A lot of bats actually can't take off from the ground. They can't fly from the ground. So sometimes if a bat's on the ground, that's just because it's not able to take off. They'll usually make their way over to something like a tree, climb up the tree, and then fly away from there. If there's a bat in your house, first of all, you should always get an adult. But a lot of the times if a bat is flying around in the house, a window can be opened, and if everything else is shut, hopefully the bat will figure it out and fly straight out the window. If the bat is not flying, then in order to get it out of the house, sometimes people will do things like put a bucket or a box over it, slide something under the bucket or the box and take it out that way. If the bat absolutely must be picked up, and only if it absolutely must, whoever's picking it up should be wearing something like very heavy gardening gloves or welding gloves or heavy work gloves, something like that before touching the animal. And if you ever have the choice, you should never be picking up animals in the wild anyway. One last thing I want to go over, vampire bats. So, vampire bats are absolutely real. They do exist. They live in South America and Central America. They do drink blood. They do only drink blood. Unless a vampire bat is absolutely desperate, they don't tend to go for human blood. Vampire bats tend to feed on a lot of farm animals, things like cows and pigs and goats and chickens, because we as humans tend to keep farm animals in one spot. And it's much easier for a bat to go back to the same farm every night than it is for them to find, say, a new wild animal every night. And most importantly, vampire bats are about that big. They are tiny. They're tiny, tiny little bats. And when they're hunting, they will fly around until they find, say, a herd of cows. They'll land on the ground. They'll scurry over to the cow. They'll climb up the ankle, and then they'll use those two big vampire teeth to make a little scratch. And then they don't suck the blood. They lick the blood. They lap it up like a cat or a dog with a water bowl. And they'll take about a teaspoon, maybe about a tablespoon of blood, and then they'll fly away. So, a couple other really cool things about vampire bats. In their saliva, there's something that will keep blood flowing. It's called an anticoagulant. It keeps the blood flowing after they make that little scratch. Not permanently, just long enough for them to get their meal. And that anticoagulant is studied a lot because medicines can be made from something that stops blood from clotting. Second of all, vampire bats are very intelligent and they're very, very social. And part of the reason for that is because a lot of the times, if a vampire bat comes back to the colony and hasn't been able to find any food, it could be in trouble. Because a vampire bat can only go about 2 days without a meal. To give you an idea, we as humans can go about 3 weeks without food on average, and only if we have to. I know it doesn't usually feel like it. But since vampire bats can't go very long without food, they could be in trouble if they come back to the colony and haven't been able to find a meal. So, a lot of the times, they will come back to the colony and make a little begging motion. And then another bat that they have a strong social bond with will scurry over and regurgitate, so throw up, some of the blood that they got that night. And the hungry bat will lick the blood out of its mouth. And that way, both of those bats get to live through the night. And it sounds a little gross, but they are both smart enough and social enough to punish cheaters. So if there are bats that only take blood and never give blood, those bats will be cut out of the sharing system by the whole colony, and then they are on their own. Okay. So for those of you who have made it this far, who have listened to me talk about all of the bats and met all of our bats, and listened to all the frequently asked questions I was just going over, I have one more surprise guest to show everybody. So give me just one moment to get him out here. Step up. Good. So this is Mortimer. And Mortimer is a little screech owl. Now I want to be very clear. Mortimer here is not a baby owl. He is a full-grown screech owl. It's just that screech owls are really, really small little owls. Now they are pretty common owls. You can find owls like Mortimer sort of all over, especially in places like Michigan here, which is where, again, where we are at the Organization for Bat Conservation. An owl like Mortimer in the wild would be eating a lot of different things. He'd be eating a lot of things like little grubs and worms if he could find them. Things like larger insects too. He'd be eating things like mice and shrews, little rodents. And a lot of the times, if an owl like Mortimer is up high in a tree, it's very, very hard for us to ever know he's there. Look at his feathers. His feathers are perfect camouflage. If he's hanging out high up in a tree and he's covered in that feather pattern, a lot of the times most things won't even know he's there. Now you can see too, Mortimer has been turning his head around a lot. So the way that owls can turn their heads like that is mostly because we can actually do something an owl can't. I want everyone for a moment, hold your head completely and totally still, and with just your eyes, everyone look up, and look down, and look left, and look right. So you just did something an owl can't do. Owls can't move their eyes in their head. So if Mortimer wants to look at something in a different direction, he's got to turn his entire head around. All right. Well, I am going to put Mortimer back. All right. So that's just about what I have for you all today. I hope you enjoyed meeting all of the bats and Mortimer. Once again, I want to ask you all to do one thing. Tell one person one cool thing you learned today about bats. It does an awful lot of good. All right. Take care, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.